Thanks, Brad, and good morning. And also, thank you, Brad, for this once-in-a-lifetime chance, which is to one-up Susan Carey. I'm not sure I'll get that again. In fact, I've always thought that in another life I could have been a hard-hitting reporter, and so today I'll get my chance to play one for just a little while. I'm honored to stand in for one of the best. We'll miss Susan's presence today, but I'll certainly do my best to pinch hit, even posing a few of her handcrafted questions. And in fact, if you're listening carefully, you just might recognize which of those questions are Susan's and which of those are mine. In any event, I'm glad we're here. I'm enthusiastic about moderating this panel because the issue could not be of more importance to the regional airline industry. The growing shortage of commercial airline pilots is a problem to our industry that is nothing short of stunning. The phrase "a perfect storm" has become cliched. We aviation types have certainly beat that drum a heck of a lot recently, but sometimes a cliche is so because it's remarkably apt. In this case, the phrase is not just accurate, it feels painfully fitting. If we look at all the disparate forces at work right now, we can easily see a walloping storm on the horizon. In a nutshell, we've got 500,000 pilots that we'll need in the next 2 decades, and the FAA is issuing far fewer pilot certificates than it has in decades past. We expect a big wave of age 65 retirements to start to hit hard and soon. Of course, the major airlines, as they replenish their supply of pilots, they'll continue to look to the regional airlines for the best and most capable aviators. They can and will and do hire from us. So just to offer some perspective, the 4 largest network carriers in the next 8 years are expected to retire 18,000 pilots. And that exceeds the total number of regional aviation pilots in our entire workforce. If that weren't enough, we have federal rules, new rules, that require most pilots to have 1,500 hours, give or take, depending on where and how you've gotten your training, in their logbooks. This has raised the cost, it's raised the duration of training for would-be pilots, and it's forcing some of them to seriously consider whether or not they'll go on. Of course, pilot pay at regional airlines has become a familiar talking point for many. The first-year, first officer wages in particular have earned intense scrutiny. Along with this, the role of collective bargaining has also come into question. Finally, the FAA has issued new pilot duty and rest rules. This was an important measure, and RAA embraced it. But it's forced airlines to pad their ranks by about 5%. You've heard it from Roger, you just heard it from Brad, and now you'll hear it from me. The Regional Airline Association is spending a lot of time on this issue. We're worried about it. But now let me introduce our panel of experts. They'll discuss this weighty topic in all of its aspects. Dan Akins is an aviation economist with 30 years' experience, and he's taken a deep dive on this subject, weighing the airline labor and training perspectives and producing data-heavy reports that illustrate the problem with an X-Acto knife's precision. Andrew Von Ah has led work on pilot workforce issues for the Congressional watchdog, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. In February, the GAO published a much-anticipated report on the subject looking at the pilot workforce. Well, the report characterized its findings as mixed. It highlighted many issues and important challenges associated with the pilot shortage. And it talked about service implications that are already taking place. Last but not least, although he needs little introduction to this crowd, we have with us Bryan Bedford, CEO since 1999 of one of the largest regional airline groups, Republic Airways Holdings. Bryan is already living with the consequences of the shortage, having removed 27 of Republic's 250 aircraft from service due to the lack of qualified pilots. Bryan is chairman of our task force, as you heard from Brad, and he shared his views in that capacity on the pilot shortage before Congress last month. So the panel will take your questions at the end of the presentation, so I hope you'll give them your best shot. In the meantime, I'll get things rolling by asking our 3 distinguished panelists to each give a brief overview of how they see the workforce issue today, why it's having the biggest effect right here on regional airlines, and what they believe will be the state of play in the next 5 or 10 years. Dan, will you start?
Thanks, Faye, and thank you for having us here today to talk about this important topic. All of us are familiar with the situation that we find ourselves in this industry. If you read the headlines from financial papers and inside airline publications, 2014 is supposed to be one of the most profitable periods in aviation history, followed by an even more profitable 2015. So we all are aware of what can go wrong with those kinds of forecasts. Usually it's from exogenous events, usually things that no one can put into their business plan affect everyone's business plan. Obviously, the largest of which in the past 2 decades was 9/11. That was followed by wars and SARS, fuel price spikes, economic collapse. However, the thing we're talking about today is something that's within our power to control. It's on the radar screen. It's a hurricane that is now just coming on shore. The depths and dimension and the strength of the winds in those hurricanes are unknown, and it's up to us to prepare and react and to position ourselves to, for once, control the events that are going to dictate the next 10 years of industry prosperity. I was going to talk a little bit about the historical structure of the industry. I think you guys, it's too early in the morning, you'd probably fall asleep. I think one of the big issues today that we find ourselves in is that there's a structural problem based on the system that pilots are trained in this country. And if you look at the way foreign carriers train pilots, many of them send their pilot cadets to U.S. flight schools for training in the Southwest where the weather is favorable, and they're sponsored by their companies or their countries to train cadet pilots in a response to a lack of pilot supply in the indigenous countries because they don't have a big enough military or they don't have as active a civilian population to produce enough commercial pilots. So there is a solution out there. We haven't practiced that solution. We haven't had to practice that solution since the late 1970s. There's been a surplus of pilots available, and to some extent the industry's been spoiled by a surplus of pilots. We've offloaded the training expense onto either the backs of the military or the students themselves. And we're starting to see the effects of a lack of people willing to undertake that expense. And I think the discussion today should really center around the causes and solutions, I hope, so that we don't walk out of here kind of scratching our heads trying to figure out what do we do next. So I think part of what I've learned in 30 years of consulting, I started out at ALPA, the Airline Pilots Association, as an economic analyst. So when I speak to groups about this problem, I want to talk about the supply from a pilot's perspective and talk about, since 9/11, what the marketplace looked like for a pilot and why there aren't any pilots in flight schools to fulfill the demand that I see on the horizon. The very predictable demand based on the seniority lists and aging out of pilots. This isn't a guess, this is actual precision. Sort of people that are age 63 today are going to be 65 in 2 years, so we know who's going to hit the age 65 retirement. On top of that, there's going to be more than 18,000 because there's going to be people that leave the profession before age 65. ALPA did a study to show that it's around 63 and a half in terms of the number of the age that people leave the profession. But getting back to the facts, there have been 3 major changes in FAA regulations and public law that we're now dealing with that we weren't dealing with a few years ago. That's laid on top of a marketplace since 9/11 where pilots in the industry have seen tens of thousands of furloughs, carriers go bankrupt, mergers and acquisitions, and generally a very risky and unfavorable environment to be a pilot. The pilots that remained in the industry, at least in the mainline carriers, saw concessions, pensions lost, the risk of bankruptcy or cessation of their carriers. So there's a whole confluence of events that if you're sitting as a prospective pilot in the United States looking at training as a pilot, it doesn't look throughout the 2000s as a very good prospect for you. And that's part of the market overlay. As we got out of the recession, we got back on our feet, the airline business started making money in 2006, 7, and 8. What did we have? Fuel price spike, and we had an age 65 rule that changed the dynamics of a stagnant market, which was as the market was beginning to develop an interest in new pilots and grow, we had our knees knocked out from under us with things that, again, were from outside the industry. At the end of the day, we had another 5 years of stagnation. Again, looking at it from a pilot's perspective, regional pilots stayed within the regionals, mainline pilots traded out after age 65. Obviously, they had to leave. But we had this problem where, again, the prospects of being a new pilot to get hired weren't based on concessions, but actually the lack of jobs available in the industry that were attractive. I think there are a number of solutions out there to solve this. It's not a simple solution. We have to regain some type of linkage between the airlines themselves, the training of cadet pilots that they want to employ at some time in the future, and that's sort of a business issue, and also dealing with some ways to deal with regulatory change that I think is going to be much worse in the next few years than it is today. And I think Bryan mentioned something in an article about we're in the bottom of the first inning, and we are in the bottom of the first inning. I didn't expect this to be happening until 2017. It's with us today. Like the moniker says, the impacts are real. And so I'm very interested to hear your questions. As Faye said, I've done a lot of research, analytical research on this topic, and I'd like to discuss that with you further. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Andrew, will you share your perspective?
Sure. Thanks, Faye. And thanks for inviting me to sit here on the panel and discuss our report with you all. We've been sitting with this issue for the last year or so, talking to all the regional airlines, talking to a number of different stakeholder groups, looking at all the data that's available. And our report's findings often get sort of characterized as, mixed, and that was sort of part of, in a couple of our headings, it said mixed evidence of such and so on. But the question of whether there's a shortage or not, whether we found a shortage or not is not really an issue. I mean, we did find a shortage, and the shortage was for first officers at regional airlines. And that's a very real shortage, and in talking to folks like Bryan and others in the room, that there's a real impact to that, and it impacts service, and it is sort of something that needs to be addressed. Where things become a little more mixed or unclear is when you look at how big of a problem is this going to be, what are the sort of implications industry-wide, what's going to happen with the majors, what's going to happen 5 years down the line. Because I think, as Dan was sort of mentioning, there's been a shift in sort of demand signals for pilots over the last 15 years or so. There haven't been a lot of jobs available. Airlines have just sort of been replacing attrition, and you've had about somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pilots on average hired a year. And now you're looking at a situation where you're looking to hire 2,000 to 4,000 a year over the next decade or so. If you look at all the forecasts and kind of congeal them down into their essence, that's kind of what they all say. And so now you've got a situation where you've got large pools out there of certificate holders in various stages of their career. You got pilot certificates or student pilot certificates and private pilot certificate holders and commercial pilot certificate holders, et cetera, who are going to then start to move through. And so the question is whether these pools are large enough, and this is a question that we get asked from our Hill clients quite a bit. Are these pools large enough to address that demand? If you look at the numbers straight up, I mean, yes, there are these large pools of certificate holders, and the question really is whether they're incentivized and have, sort of see a career path and see a way forward that they can, that it makes sense for them to pursue that kind of a career, and pursue that next certificate and get the hours that they need to get to that stage. And so, I think that's, there are two sort of main factors that we kind of came to understand or sort of were the big things to consider here. And one was obviously the wages that they're going to be facing at the early part of their career, how long they face those wages before they can start to repay what is becoming a mounting student debt for many pilots coming out of pilot school. And so, these are two issues that I think clearly have to be addressed in some way. The regulatory issues where we're talking about sort of having to have more hours simply exacerbates the problem, because now you've got a longer period of time where you're at basically entry-level wages and a higher cost to get to that level, certificate level, that allows you to sort of be, continue in that airline pilot career. So those were the sort of the main issues that we found, and I think, as was mentioned, there are several ways to deal with those kinds of issues. We brought them up in our report. We didn't make any recommendations, but this was something that we sort of laid out some options for Congress to consider, and we'll see what they do in the next months.
Bryan, will you share your thoughts?
Thank you, Faye, and good morning to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to come at this slightly differently, so bear with me just a second. I love telling stories. So Dan has, I think, laid out articulately all the reasons why you don't want to become an airline pilot. Andrew's said it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to become an airline pilot. So I'll just tell a little bit of a story here. So I graduated from high school in 1979, and I couldn't afford to go to college, so I went to work at our local Piper aircraft manufacturing plant in Lakeland, Florida as a production scheduler. And after 2 years, I was able to save up enough money to go to school, and went to Florida State University, go Noles, and got into the airline business in 1987 with Continental Airlines, and all on the sort of the finance and accounting side. So not an operations guy, not a pilot guy, but those couple of years I was with Piper Aircraft, I always had that bug about thinking about becoming a pilot. Now I'm in the airline business, and it's 1993, and I'm in my first CEO job at Business Express, High Oakley. And tough situation, but it was a restructuring process, and it required us to sit down with the Airline Pilots Association and negotiate a concessionary contract, which was no fun. But all I kept hearing from the pilots is, you just don't understand what it's like to be a pilot. You can't appreciate what we go through. You don't understand the sacrifices that we make. And I didn't understand. When I went to my next CEO job in Minneapolis with Masaba, I made a point of deciding I was going to finally become a pilot. So went through the private pilot process. That was a lot of fun. Got a commercial multi-engine instrument rating. That was a lot of fun. And over the course of 4 years of building time, hired every CFII I trained with. You know, these were young men and women who were passionate about aviation. These were definitely professional, well-trained, again, young 20-something individuals who, you know, had a desire to do something more than just get a job. I mean, for them, flying was a passion. And there were no barriers that were going to stop them from achieving that goal. You know, that wasn't the focus on the career path. I mean, this is something that they wanted to do. And that aspirational side of flying, I still think exists today in many young men and women. But for the reasons that Dan articulated, it creates a lot of caution. And for the economic challenges that Andrew alluded to, we've put that career further and further out of reach for thousands upon thousands of young men and women, and that is a tragedy. When I was testifying in DC, I had a chance to talk to some of the ALPA members who were sitting behind Captain Moak, and when you sit down with, and we have many pilots in the room today, I'd love to chat with you, and you talk about how they got into the industry, many of them followed a very similar path of do it yourself, you know, training, perseverance, fortitude, significant sacrifice, doing the flight training. But most of these men I talked to at this hearing only had 300, 400, 500 hours of time before they entered into the commercial airline business. Now, I would argue that today the system is extraordinarily more safer in terms of what we've learned over those past 25 or 30 years, you know, whether it's cockpit resource management, you know, the new scheduling fatigue rules, how we train pilots, the automation on the airplanes, the automation in the system. The system learns from, unfortunately, from accidents, and we build safety into the system. And to say that a pilot with, you know, 300, 400, 500 hours 30 years ago was safe with the extraordinary challenges they faced with unautomated aircraft, operating with an airspace that was, you know, we just didn't know nearly as much as we do today, that those same pilots are now somehow unsafe is just wrong. It's factually inaccurate. And so with all the challenges that we face as an industry to aspire or inspire pilots to come into the profession, and I'd say the same thing with maintenance technicians and a whole host of other support roles in aviation in general, and with the significant expense to now layer in that an additional requirement to build 1,000 hours of non-productive, unstructured time, which frankly at $200 an hour, if you have to pay for it, it's just not achievable. You know, we've in essence as an industry, as in a nation, we've shot ourselves in the foot. We can do better, we need to do better, and we can't, you know, hide behind an argument of it's a safety issue when it's not. And we can talk about, you know, market-based pay solutions. That'll have to come in the context of a broader discussion on collective bargaining, I'm afraid. But we can't ignore it, we can't run away from it, and the consequences of doing nothing, I think, are going to be profound in the not too distant future. So again, I would appeal to those young men and women who are at University Commons that it is a great job. When I learned to fly and I sat down in my next collective bargaining process with the pilots, it was like, I'm on to your dirty little secret. You know, it's the best job in the world, but you have to have a passion for it. And I think there are thousands of young men and women in this country that would, if we enabled them to have a pathway to succeed. So let's work on that collectively.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks to each of you for offering your perspective. This is great. Just a note on structure. I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask a couple of questions, but as you can see, we have 2 mics out in the room. So if you'd like to ask a question, please make your way to one of them, and when you get the mic, please identify your name and your company so we know who we're talking to. And I'll just ask our moderators also, please, especially because we have one fewer participant, we have a lot of time, so feel free to talk to one another so that we can get the best conversation going and organically talk with the audience and among ourselves. I think that will be great. To start, Andrew, I'd just like to reflect what you said in your opening remarks, is that, and also you had this in your study too, that right now, the pool, technically speaking, of pilots is adequate. And yet, you found that regional carriers are struggling to find sufficient candidates, even in spite of significant hiring bonuses, the fact that wages have increased. But the regional airlines can't find the pilots, and that they're unable to meet their flying schedules because of it. They've in fact had to reduce flights. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things at work. I mean, we've talked about wages. It's and the high cost of education that, these folks are coming out with sort of large debts that they have to pay, and they're looking at really small wages to start. So it may not be, it's not something that, they're jumping into necessarily, and so you definitely have that issue. The other issue is, with the regulatory changes, you've essentially kind of cut in half your pool of potential employees. You've got, rather than a commercial certificate, you now have to have an ATP certificate, right? So, that's essentially cuts it in half. Right. Now you've got folks that are coming out of school. You've got all the regional airlines now that there's demand, that people are hiring. You've got the majors now announcing hiring plans, which sort of are these demand signals. You've got them all fighting over sort of the best candidates that are coming out and the top candidates that are there. So, those are some of the reasons why.
Okay, so
if I could, Faye, I think one of the challenges in your opening remarks, you said, let's not equivocate. We have a shortage. But when asked the question directly by, I forget which congressperson, to Dr. Dillingham, Dr. Dillingham, do we have a shortage? No, sir, I do not have a shortage. And so with these mixed messages, it's going to be really hard to focus Congress and engage them in terms of...
Well, I would never disagree with Dr. Dillingham.
Nobody else did either.
No, but I mean, this is a common kind of, this is a difficult issue, right? It's a bit of a conundrum because you've got an industry where the larger carriers are not experiencing this shortage. The majors are not experiencing a shortage. They'll tell you that. They'll show you the numbers of, that they can find ample applicants that have, thousands of hours. And so, whether the industry as a whole is seeing a shortage, you'd have to say, well, no. But is there a shortage? Sure. And a shortage can be, a regional thing. It can be, part of the industry is facing a shortage. Other parts are not. And so, it's a little bit more of a dynamic and complicated issue than just is there or is there not a shortage.
I guess, how many of you folks have read the GAO report that Andrew and Dr. Dillingham put together? And you folks all realize that
That's 10 times more than any other GAO report.
These guys are plugged in. What's actually a very difficult task for someone, and I assume that Andrew's introduction to the airline business was through this project, is to not understand the dynamics of why the mainline carriers don't have a shortage and why they're drawing down the pilot from the regional and other areas. And I think the task that GAO was asked to accomplish here is fairly difficult. One of the issues that I've had with the results of the study is that nobody in here thinks the results of a pilot shortage are mixed, that we have a question about it, right? Whether it's raining or sunny outside is pretty clear. The GAO thinks it's mixed, and I think it's based on when Dr. Dillingham testified in front of Congress on 3 parts of a study, 2 of which I think are deeply flawed, and I'll tell you why. And it's not a knock on the GAO, it's just being in the industry and knowing where the data sits and knowing what happened. The GAO looked to prove in theory what is actually happening in practice by looking at historical data from 2000 to 2012. Anybody know any exogenous variables that might have affected pilot supply during that 10-year period, which is the most tumultuous period the industry's ever experienced? The GAO completely ignored those exogenous variables in that period. So during that period, they didn't see any wage increases. In fact, pilots at most mainline carriers, which represent the majority of pilots, experienced a 30% cut in wages, benefits, and work rules, okay? So there's no doubt about why that happened. But the GAO report didn't focus on that. In fact, they looked at economic theory to see if there was a pilot shortage. Well, against Shakespeare's words, past is not prologue in this industry. It's happening now. It's a brush fire. We look like California with a bunch of dry tinder. It's going to expand, okay? The forecasters that GAO used, in my opinion, were completely unvetted. One of the fellows that they relied upon heavily to forecast out whether there's a pilot shortage or not was a kid who's got a website who's the first officer at SkyWest Airlines. Now, he's probably a great pilot, probably completely unqualified to assess whether or not there's a pilot shortage in the future. In fact, there's a pilot shortage now that in his report written a year ago didn't see happening, okay? And the pilot shortage, by virtue of the way in which pilots' careers evolve, is always going to be at the lowest end of the pay scale, which is at the regional airlines, okay? So we're not going to have a problem at the mainline carriers. They're the last to have a problem. But I don't think they're able to avoid this problem due to the degree that the mainlines depend on the services provided by people like Brian and others in this room through regional carriers. It's a big footprint. And if we don't fix this, that big footprint is going to have gigantic ramifications, not just for our industry, but for small towns, communities, manufacturers, businesses, people that are selling things in this hall. We might be at the peak of the regional airline business right now. And I would hate to see that factors that are within our control add to the degradation of services that regional airlines can provide to small communities. The one fact, the practical fact that the GAO found was that 11 of 12 regional airlines were having a pilot shortage. No surprise. When I was out on the road a year and a half, 2 years ago looking at this and realizing that some of the effects that the market has had on flying and pilot careers in the United States is that flight schools are full. Flight schools have been full since 9/11. Flight schools have good demand. Where do they have good demand from? Most flight schools, I'm talking about Part 141, the higher level of training, have foreign students filling the bulk of their classrooms and their cockpits, okay? Those people aren't going to be around to help us solve our problem. The flight schools probably looked at the diminishing demand by US students and went out to find foreign carriers who would pay for their training, either an ab initio or some type of loan program, to pay for their students to get trained in the United States. Go around to Phoenix, California, Florida, take a look at the students in those classrooms, mostly from Asia or Europe, very few from the United States. And my concern right now is even if we had walked out of here with the solution, Brian could go out and fix his problem right now and get 1,500-hour qualified pilots. It takes years to do that. So to attract people today means we're not going to have pilots ready to enter the workforce for a couple of years. And that's a big, intractable lag that we've got looking at us today that is not solvable in the short term. Even if you raise entry-level pilot pay, even if you reduce 1,500 hours or some other pathway to an apprenticeship program, or if they go abroad. And the problem is pilots that come out of flight school today have between 250 to 300 hours generally. They're getting recruited to fly abroad because they're hireable at that level. Whether they come back to the US workforce is another question. So this isn't just about us in the US, it's about the worldwide demand. And we can't ignore that at Embry-Riddle and at University of North Dakota, when people get minted with CFIIs and they come out with commercial multi-engine certificates like Brian had, there's going to be people pulling on their shoulders saying, come abroad, I'll give you an apartment or a nice condo, I'll take you in a limo to the airport. This is what we're facing. And I think the GAO report, in some sense, has been a great disservice to this problem, because what I've seen is that it's emboldened simple mythological solutions to the problem. The principal one being that if we raise entry-level regional pilots, we're suddenly going to have a big rush of these shadow pilots, the 70,000 pilots who are commercially qualified that may be in their 70s today, that may be congressmen today, that aren't going to enter the workforce. And if they are going to enter the workforce, they're going to stand in line for the $60 an hour job at mainline carriers and not the $30 or $25 an hour job at regional carriers. And that is a structural problem that we've got. I've got, some solutions, some sort of business models that other carriers from foreign countries have used to fix this problem, but we haven't even engaged yet. We haven't even started the structure yet. So that's slinging mud at Andrew, and I apologize.
Just to defend our report on a couple of points, and I appreciate the criticism, but on the other hand, we didn't just rely on a single forecast. We looked at all the forecasts that were available. And we provided a whole range of what that looked like over the next decade. So we didn't rely on just one pilot and on a computer who was blogging away. Just to clarify that. And they also, just to point out, I mean, when you look at a labor shortage, and we did look at it theoretically, we looked at it sort of like how does one look at evaluating a pilot shortage? There's no single measure for it. There's a lot of different factors that you have to bring into play to sort of evaluate what the extent of it is and what it really looks like. And so you establish a baseline looking at past data, because that is data. That's stuff that actually happened, that it does exist. And we didn't, I don't think, ignore the fact that over that period there were a lot of upheaval in the industry and a lot of problems in the industry that resulted in exactly that outcome. And I think we acknowledge that in the report. Not only that, but that's a huge reason. Sort of, if you're not hiring, that's a signal that, it's a demand signal that there's no demand, there's no jobs, right? So when you start to hire, this is now a demand signal that, there's going to be a lag, obviously, because you got to, start to attract people back into that career path. But so just to defend our report a little bit.
I'm going to let you come back to all of that as well, but first we'll take a question from the audience.
Other than that, I agree.
Good morning. To Linda Larson with Mass Flight. Excellent panel. And Dan, you hit on something that forms the basis of my question, and that is the unintended consequence of small community air service. And then you said the other word which comes to mind, which is how do we engage them? How do we get allies at the grassroots through small communities who are going to be the victims in the end of this pilot shortage?
Right. I think that's great, Linda. Great to see you. When I formed this company, Flight Path Economics, about a year ago with a colleague in the back of the room, Matt Barton, and we both had been in the airline business for a while, I'd seen a lot of different aspects of the airline industry, and I'd worked in air service development for small communities and large communities in my past, and I know kind of what drove the demand for those services in those communities. And I looked at the system, the essential air service system and other sort of props to make sure that small communities had air service. And I thought, in this situation, if we truly have a lack of qualified aviators to service those small communities, which obviously are really important collectively to the country and to mainline network carriers to have feed to fly into Tokyo from San Francisco, that if you start pulling the bricks slowly away from those communities, either in diminished service or in loss of service, that it starts to have a ripple effect across our whole economy. And so the first paper we put out this spring that Matt and I did as Flight Path Economics, I wanted to shoot a flare gun off, and I wanted to say, let's pay attention to this as a country. Let's not pay attention to it as the RAA or A4A or Boeing or Embraer. Let's pay attention to it as the ramifications that are going to be much broader than the industry itself. And I likened communities today trying to attract business by saying, guess what, they just turned off our internet. We got unplugged. You still want to come here, IBM plant or Firestone factory? Do you want to be in Muscle Shoals, Alabama? We just lost our feeder service. Nobody's going to want that. And so this is a huge threat to small communities. And so the flare gun that I thought we would shoot off is let's take a realistic approach to see what the ramifications would be if small communities, to some extent, lost their service. To the airline industry, it's between $10 and $20 billion of revenue hit across the industry, regionals, mainline, FedEx, everybody that ships on passenger airplanes or cargo airplanes is going to have that effect. If you multiply that out to all the jobs that are attached to all these different booths around here and all these different communities and places around the world, it's $50 to $100 billion easily of economic impact. It's dispersed, it's diffuse, but collectively it's a huge problem, and it's way bigger than what happened after 9/11 to this industry. Okay, so if you match that and say, is that a big enough flare to get the public's attention? I think since this spring, there's been a lot of natural traction because guess what? There actually is a pilot shortage and communities are losing air service, and there isn't a simple solution. I went out to a conference last month to address some smaller communities, all sort of pulling on my coattails, chambers of commerce, people that wanted to stimulate air service, and I said, I'm sorry, by having your Chamber of Commerce guarantee a load factor or a revenue figure is not going to put a qualified pilot in the cockpit of those airplanes. And that's the problem that we face. It's different, it's structural. Paying for service is not going to solve the problem. What could happen is you have a community paying service to a carrier that serves 5 communities, and it might ordinarily change where they lose service. They might go from the next town to lose service to the 5th or 10th or 15th, but it's still going to happen. And again, we're in the bottom of the first inning here, and there's a lot of territory to cover, and we need to start reacting right now to save this air service to small communities, because the impact, while diffuse, is going to be gigantic.
Well, in order to get there, again, step one is to acknowledge you have a problem. And currently, government's confused about this issue.
We need a 12-step program.
We need an intervention, and that's why, you know, part of the RAA focus of this convention has been, as Linda was referring to, building that broader coalition, trying to speak as one voice, whether that is through the university and structured training inputs, whether that's from the airport perspective, who rely on passenger demand in order to create federal matching dollar grants for airport improvement projects, or the communities themselves, which Congress, for the most part, relies on to get to work generally. So I think, you know, there should be plenty of stakeholders in the mix that are going to, you know, lock arms on this. But again, and this shouldn't be referred to as an attack on the GAO or you personally, Andrew, but again, it would be more helpful if we could talk about this from a holistic perspective, as opposed to segmenting. This part of the industry is fine, this part of the industry is maybe having some trouble.
Great, thanks. We talked a little bit in the first round about how big the pool is, how many pilots are out there. So let's talk for a moment about what the pool looks like. I'll start with you, Andrew. Your report noted that regional airlines are experiencing a decline in the quality of new applicants since the 1,500-hour rules took effect. So in essence, because the type of flying that they're doing is GA type, fair weather flying, and not the customized training that the airlines are providing in their own structured training program. So can you talk a little bit about this? How serious of a concern is this?
I think it's definitely a serious concern. And this is one of those unintended consequences, right? I mean, essentially what the regulatory change created was this gap in training, right? Now you've got folks that are looking to fill those hours in whatever way they can find it, and again, those are going to be sort of low-wage jobs that they're working in a lot of cases. They're going to be finding hours however they can. They're going to be flight instructors and so on. So you're just getting further and further away from a structured environment where, you know, you're learning what it means to be an airline pilot. So, you know, I think that does create a problem. I mean, what FAA tried to do and what the ARC committee sort of suggested that they do was to give credit for a lot, you know, different kinds of training, and they did some of that, and they didn't do all of it. But I mean, I think that is a real problem. You know, the solution to that is whether FAA can sort of revisit what it's done, and whether it sees a big enough issue that it can start to change sort of the pilot training parameters and qualifications that are necessary, and they do have, you know, some room to do that. But I think that's going to require I think as you were all alluding to, sort of a louder voice that we really need this changed.
Brian, what's your take on that?
Well, I'd say two things, Faye. The 1,500-hour plus pilots have always been out there. 3 years ago we could have hired them, but we didn't. Because when we vet pilots, we go through a number of qualitative and quantitative factors. And what we've historically found is, the pilot who's coming out of a structured training program, frankly, hasn't had time to develop a whole lot of bad habits. And then so we can take them, with several hundred hours of structured training time in an academic environment, and we can bring them, and so they have really great proficiency without any of the sort of the negative habits that you create by flying in an unstructured, single pilot environment. So very ready for the type of commercial airline training that they're going to receive from any of the regionals that are here. And so what we find now is we're looking at, we can't look at that population of pilots anymore. And so we could argue there isn't a shortage. Those pilots are still there. They're just no longer technically qualified under the statute. So we look at a different set of pilots. Last year, Republic had a demand for 500 first officers. We vetted nearly 2,400 quote on paper qualified candidates. We were able to extend employment offers to 450 of them. So that's a little, 20%-ish hit rate. Through the first 4 months of this year, we vetted over 1,000 potential candidates, and we were able to, I think the number's 88 to 90 pilots that we were actually met all of our criteria that we could extend employment offers to. So, we've gone very quickly from sort of a 20% qualification rate, again meeting our requirements, to 10. And we're all, as an industry, we're all looking at the same couple of thousand qualified candidates. So it's a diminishing pool. It's diminishing quickly.
Thank you. An audience question?
Thank you. Becky Ludy, University of Nebraska, Omaha Aviation Institute, and I have a problem. So, and our problem actually is recruiting of students. Not a big surprise to anyone in the room, but to recruit people into the aviation program, and then they have the cost of a 4-year degree. They have the added cost of $45,000 plus in flight training, which yes, you can do student loans and those kind of things. But then they're graduating out and saying, and now you have this gap to fill before you can really go out and get some of this back to start paying off the loans. So we have issues with that as well. So I guess my question really is, what do you see as solutions, and particularly what do you see the university role in solutions to these issues?
I'll take that one. First, I think we do have to come together in this broader coalition and talk, I think one-on-one with members of Congress to really let them know how this is impacting you at home. This is how folks in your district are feeling about this issue. And again, we are in the early innings on this. So right now it's manifesting itself with young men and women making career choices different than what they might have made. And so that has an implication in the here and now, but it has a much deeper, longer lasting implication 3, 4, 5 years, because the folks that you're putting in school are the folks we're going to be relying on to operate the nation's air service 5 years from now. And if the gap coming out of your program, say they come out with 250 to 300 hours, if the gap were 200 hours, as a regional airline business, we could come up with solutions to help bridge that gap. We'd work with our partners in organized labor, to come up with programs that would, cadet-type programs that would allow us to help them build that time. But if the gap is 1,000 hours, it's just a bridge too far. So I can understand the very difficult recruiting job you have to tell students, prospective students, that this is a great pathway. And the unfortunate thing is, it is a great career-long earning opportunity. And for all the travails and tumult of the industry over the past decade, through consolidation, through restructuring, through refleeting, the nation's global airlines have never been healthier, and the future's frankly never been brighter. And we can look at structured attrition. We saw this in 2007. Let's not forget, we saw this in 2007, and two things happened. We did a legislative change to push out age 60 to 65, bought us 5 more years, and we went into the Great Recession. which again prolong the healing process for the nation's airlines. So who knows whether we'll find another exogenous event that will delay the process further, but it's hard to see that right now. I mean, the future for the nation's air carriers economically looks very bright, and U.S. carriers are quite vital right now.
I think one thing that I've found through a colleague probably of yours, Dr. Lovelace up at University of North Dakota, is that aspiring cadets in university and across the country, from his research, once the 1,500-hour rule became effective, a lot of his CFIs that were aspiring commercial airline pilots dropped out, left the program, did no longer want to be a pilot because that was a bridge too far. And so I think what I'm seeing, and it's again this mixed idea that we're going to be able to solve this somehow with this shadow pilot force or by raising wages, that's not going to fix it. It's not a structural solution. So I think what's going to have to happen, I think Bryan would agree, they've been speaking about this at the board level, is a different business relationship with flight schools and a different business relationship with individual pilots that incentivizes pilots to enter the workforce without having this big debt burden to carry around, and it would help attract people to the profession. The model's out there. The foreign carriers do it.
I agree with that, Dan, but you know, we have a longer timeline for that. You know, so there's the here and now concern, and you know, the RAA position is to FAA to implement the statute as Congress intended, which is essentially to adopt the ARC recommendation, and that ARC recommendation was based on subject matter experts from across the industry, including labor. So the ARC recommendation, were it to be adopted tomorrow, would provide the temporary relief that we need to build the structured future.
Right. And I think what Bryan's talking about is the pipeline, the pipeline from graduation to a job. And what I was talking about really is the business relationship that's the obstacle to people entering the profession. And I think, you know, in the talks that I've given about this, there is a separation. There's a business solution that involves carrier sponsorship in the longer term, and a sort of a lock-in on training costs and expenses to keep those people in the cockpit for a certain number of years or a certain number of hours. The other part of it is, what Bryan was addressing, is the pipeline issue. The ARC recommendations are different than the law today, and I think both of those have to work in order to make the system work. And it requires a different way to think about our pilot growing process and our pruning of pilots. I was just, interestingly enough, I was just in a mediation in Dallas yesterday, and the guy who was mediating it, Jim McKenzie, was a Northwest 747 pilot, retired, and I said to him, Jim, you know, were you safe at 200, 300 hours? He goes, look, I was landing on carrier decks with a high-speed jet at 120 hours. And so the concept to pilots who know this, the 1,500-hour rule, does not relate to competency in any way. In fact, the subject matter experts that testified before Congress years ago said that there was no relationship between quantity and quality. And it's the exact thing Bryan was talking about, bad habits. In fact, people with 500 hours were more proficient in the cockpit than people with 1,200 or 1,500 hours. And so this relationship of hours is sort of a knee-jerk reaction based on the Buffalo incident. I think we have to focus our energy on fixing that, because it relates back to the classroom problem that you've got, is who's going to be interested in being a pilot. Now that there's hiring, you face this years-long, $150,000 obstacle that's in their way that has to be changed. So,
take another audience question.
Good morning, Jan Steenblick, Airline Pilot Magazine, published by the Airline Pilots Association. Morning, Dan, long time no see.
Yep.
If you would suffer me an observation and then a question. Observation, last week I was having a tremendous adventure up north, flying around on Wasaya Airways, which is a small regional airline that serves 25 or so First Nations communities beyond where the road ends. And one of the types of operations that Wasaya conducts is single pilot, single engine, scheduled, chartered cargo flights in Cessna Caravans and Pilatus PC-12s. With all due respect, Ms. Black, I don't know where you got the notion about flying, fair weather flying, because, for example, what those folks do up there, and this is on the airline, but there are non-airline people doing something comparable. Wasaya has an op spec that allows them to fly VFR in 301. And I saw it from the right seat. And my 24-year-old, yes, captain on the Caravan brought us back to Pickle Lake at 301, and I will never forget it. I was telling another Canadian regional airline executive I know about this yesterday, and he said, after all of the years that he spent flying up north, northern Ontario, with basically no ATC, very few nav aids, gravel runways, and bad weather, he knows that someone who has survived 3 years up there knows how to make good decisions. And not all of the people who are building time towards the 1,500 or the 1,250, the 1,000 or whatever hours are just flying around on a sunny day in Phoenix. Some of them are operating in some of the nastiest weather. They're flying lower performance airplanes, low down in the weather, not above it. And they're facing some real pilot and command decision situations. Yes, somebody behind me just said CFIs. Now, my question is triggered by something that Mr. Bedford said, and I must say that I was so excited to hear you say that you became a pilot, and whether you understand the dirty little secret, but at any rate, now you know much more about what it's like. And you said that you hired each of the CFIIs who trained you. Okay, so this gets me to finally, thank you for your patience, to my question. On the GA side, you're probably aware that AOPA and EAA have petitioned the FAA 2 years ago to create a driver's license medical, which would not affect airline pilots, but just the GA base out there. And some of the members of the Congressional GA caucus have gone way beyond that and introduced the General Aviation Pilot Protection Act, GAPA, which would permit pretty expanded driver's license medical, 6,000 pounds, 6 seats, 250 knots. So is RAA following this? Are you supporting it? Because it would seem to me that if that went through and then a lot more people then entered the GA community, there would be jobs for CFIs who could then build more time, and CFIIs, and you would maintain that FBO and flight school base that would help them build time into regional airline pilot jobs.
Well, I'll address the RAA question. Yes, we're supportive of things that bring GA pilots into the pipeline. We're supportive of creating future aviators. So, and thank you for sharing that anecdote about the type of flying that you might do in one given scenario. I think that were that more typical, were we seeing that across the board, that there were that type of flying, then we may not have the same questions about whether the GA type flying is going to really prepare them, future pilots, for a scenario-based situation that they'll encounter in their professional career. But Brian, you wanted to weigh in.
I was only going to make the point that in Canada, that guy can actually go fly for Air Canada with 250 hours. You know, he's not legal here, right, but he's certainly legal to fly in Canada and fly cross-border into the U.S. That same pilot would be legal to fly in Mexico, but he would be illegal to fly here. He would be legal to safely fly trans-border from Mexico into the U.S. That same pilot would be legal in Nassau, but is illegal here. That's the sort of the ridiculous nature of what we're up against. Those are good pilots. Nobody's arguing that those aren't great pilots. We'd love to have them in our business, but we can't. So how is that fair to that pilot?
Yeah, I think to add on to that, I think the anecdotal kind of weeds out there are going to support your contention that every single pilot is flying around towing banners in a Cessna.
Yeah,
but the pipeline that we need to expand to fill 18,000 jobs just on age 65 alone with no growth and no other attrition is too voluminous, huge, for Wasilla and a whole collection of carriers that are, you know, out there in the hinterland to fill. So we're tasking this pipeline that may be as big as a straw to handle a 6-foot sewer pipe worth of demand. And that's the problem. That's the pipeline issue. And I think we need to separate that out from attractiveness of the industry to a career pilot who has an obstacle of paying $100,000 to $150,000. Those are two separate problems, but they're related, and we need to fix that. And I agree that there are some pilots who are doing, you know, incredible things at, you know, landing on a carrier at 125 hours in the Navy. That guy's not qualified to fly a regional prop plane into Seattle. And that's, you think about the logic behind that, it doesn't make any sense.
Great. Let's change tracks just for a moment here. Dan, several regional pilot groups have recently rejected tentative labor agreements that would have improved their wages and offered them enhanced flow up to a major. So what's going on there? Was it too little, too late, or is this just a question of using the leverage while you've got it?
Right. Well, I think, you know, I think Brian would agree that the entry-level pay today is probably too low to offset the huge costs. The return on investment is probably bad. I've looked at it. Spending $100,000 to $150,000, you're not really above break even until you're in your 5th or 6th year at a regional carrier. So that's part of the problem. I think what's going on now, and I think some of the regional carriers, including the big, really the big three, Envoy, formerly Eagle, ExpressJet and ASA, under SkyWest, and the latest one at Republic, are different animals. They're different kinds of contracts. I think the contract that Brian put out in front of his pilots had hundreds of millions of dollars in it. I've been in touch with people who've costed it out. I trust them. The pilots turned that down, and I asked them last week, the head of the Republic Pilots Association, why they turned it down. And I think they're fighting an old battle, which is there's somehow this perception that there's a race to the bottom going on in the regional airline industry, which was going on back when carriers were dumping thousands of trained pilots from mainline carriers. There was excess supply, and people wanted to fly. So that oversupply pushed the entry-level wage rates down. That's a problem that needs to be addressed. The Republic contract did address that. Pilots had as much in collective interest over the term of the collective increase over the term of that contract of as much as 30% increases. I think they turned it down because they think that the regional airline industry has been underpriced. People have stayed in it too long. But to buttress that up against what's actually happened with mainline pilot pay, the last rounds of negotiations within the largest carriers have produced the largest pilot pay increases that have ever been seen in the industry. Delta started it out in 2012 with a cumulative 20%, followed by Continental United with around 40 to 50%, followed by American US Airways with up to 70% pay increases, not including the fact that a lot of those pilots now, because of age 65, are going to go from the right-hand seat with that 70% increase in pay in the right-hand seat to an even bigger raise when they turn into a pilot, which is another 40% jump to a captain on the left seat. So right now, it's never been better in terms of growth. If you're a pilot with 100 or 1,500 hours flying for a Part 121 carrier, to turn that machine on, that career machine, because people are getting sucked out the top, everybody's moving up, and you've got this huge increase in pay by virtue just of the system churning. So I'm confused by it. I know what a concessionary contract looks like. I know what a beneficial contract looks like. The last contract that was turned down by Republic pilots was a beneficial contract. It didn't meet their aspirational goals, but it had the highest pay rates that I've ever seen in a regional contract for a captain. And so to fight this old battle that they're part of some race to the bottom is a 10 years ago argument. And I think those sentiments are still there because there's a lot of pilots at regional airlines who were affected by the stagnation, were affected by the age 65 rule, which essentially plugged up that trap door to go up to the main lines because guys could stick around from 60 to 65. That door was sealed for a while and compounded by the fact that we had a recession. So I think there's a lot of emotion in these deals, but I think, and I asked the pilots that I talked with last week, is this a career job at Brian's carrier? No, it's not a career job. Their career expectation is to be at FedEx, United, American, places where they can make way more money over their career. So I'm kind of confounded by it. I faced the fellows who turned it down, and I still don't understand the reasons. It doesn't seem like a logical argument to me.
Thank you. We've got time for one last audience question before I move to the rapid round.
Hi. Good morning. My name is Captain Rick Dubinsky, retired from United Airlines after 37 years, 1 month, and 23 days, but I never kept track of it. I'm one of those shadow pilots. I'm rated on everything from a 737 to a 747-400. Flew every airplane United had over that period of time. And obviously, I'm a statistic that can't come back to the airline industry. When I started, there was truly a pilot shortage. The Vietnam War was in full force. The military was hanging on to every pilot they could. And you're looking at a 270-hour wonder that got hired by United Airlines. Would they let me sit in the right seat of an airplane at that time? Absolutely not. I had to start out as a flight engineer, and I served as a flight engineer for 2 years. Well over 1,000 hours as a flight engineer. I learned the airline, and I learned the industry, and I learned the operation at a time when it was far simpler. All of this automation has just tried to fill the gap of the overload that the human that sits in that airplane is experiencing as a result of far more aircraft, a much more complicated operation, the regulatory overlay, the TSA, everything that we all know is out there. So I had an opportunity for 2 years to apprentice before they would give me the right to go into the right seat of that airplane. And I served with a captain that in that day was truly a captain. He wasn't being pushed. He wasn't being overloaded with the potential for disciplinary action if he turned on an airplane for mechanical reasons. There was all kinds of opportunities to learn my craft. And by the time I did get into the right seat of that aircraft, I had the experience. Not the time didn't matter, but I had the experience. The problem that exists today is that there's no opportunity to get that experience. You get in the right seat with 250 hours, and you're going to apprentice while you're actually flying an airplane. That is not the way to do it. So what this industry has to do is to figure out a way, however you train them, get them the experience before you let them actually fly the aircraft. That's just my comment.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rick. I don't think we can look back to the days of 3 chairs in the cockpit as a solution. I do think, while for guys like you and me at our age, that cockpit automation is a challenge for the next generation of aviators, that cockpit automation is second nature. Again, you know, we're sort of a victim. Oh, he's coming back. Well, let me finish before you cross-examine me. You know, the automation that's built into the system is actually here to make the aviation business safer, not to increase the pilot workload. The fact that we've got ground proximity warning systems, the fact that we've got air traffic management systems, all of these things are working in concert to build safety into the system so that we don't need that third set of eyes, you know, working the E3B wheel, monitoring the fuel gauges. I mean, you know, the airplane simply can do a lot more. We don't need that flight engineer.
Look, here's the problem that I believe the industry faces. The passion that you addressed when you first made your comment, I clearly had that passion because I started as a kid at 22 years old in the industry. I had very little time in airplanes. In fact, I was an experienced skydiver. I probably had more time in free fall than I had actually sitting in an airplane. But the desire was there and the incentive was there. As a flight engineer, I was probably earning as much as your captains do today in real dollars. And I earned that for 2 years. And then I became a co-pilot. I was 24 years old when I was flying 737s around. I was making more money than I could possibly spend at age 24. But I lived where I worked. I didn't have to commute. The job was desirable. I had at least 15 days a month off. I was with my family. I could go where I want. And as you well know, and I well know from having negotiated that contract for your pilots as a representative of the Teamsters, your pilots are virtually, they're commuters. They have, 10, 11 days off as a minimum. They have to commute. They have to have crash pads. That didn't exist when I started. It was a desirable job. It was a fun job. It was a well-paying job. That is not the case today. None of those 3 elements exist today. And if you want pilots to come into this industry, you've got to make it attractive for them. You've got to make it something they want to do and that they'll do with a family. it's a career right now that puts pressures on pilots. So they say, one, why would I do it? And two, why would I stay?
Yeah, I think.
Well, let me just respond to that. I don't agree with that, Rick. I mean, and I'll tell you why. You know, we have bases all over the country. You know, we encourage pilots to live in their base. Now, many of them will come here and do that, but for their own reasons will choose to live in perhaps a more tax favorable jurisdiction. They want to live in Phoenix, they want to live in Orlando. I mean, people will make, you know, their own choices on that, and we don't restrict that. I would prefer pilots to want to live in base and be part of that community, and many of ours do. But again, I mean, those are personal decisions. You made one that worked for you and your family. Other people make different decisions. No one's going to come to Republic and spend 10 years in the right seat of an airplane. And ideally, no one's going to come to Republic and spend 4 years in the right seat of an airplane. And you know, whether they stay or go is, again, a personal matter. But we have a very senior captain workforce. Most of our attrition is actually in the right seat, not in the left seat. So there is something desirable here. Yes, maybe, you know, certainly we try to make it better, but we also live as a, you know, we serve, you know, multiple partners who have their own economic demands from us. And it's no different in this industry than in what we're seeing in manufacturing. We're seeing Boeing and Airbus put tremendous pressure on their suppliers to be more innovative, to be more economical. So again, their customer, mainline carriers, can, you know, get the benefit of a good product at a good price. We live in that same environment. So maybe at the end of the day, the industry will in fact get a lot smaller. You know, maybe there are just some aircraft that are going to be non-economic and they won't be flown. Maybe those pilot resources will be husband to, you know, more valuable added products. I don't know, but.
Brian, I'm not picking on Republic because Republic's not my target. It's endemic to the entire industry, including larger carriers that are somewhat on the fringe of the industry like Allegiant. They all have the same problems. The domiciles and the bases are fragile. They move around. So a pilot might be based in one city this month, and in your industry, because the majors tell you where to fly and when to fly and how to fly, you move the flying to another city. Those pilots who are now commuting or at least had crash pads where they were flying in the previous month have to go to a totally different month. There is no stability in your industry in that regard.
You can't speak in such absolute terms, Rick. There's no stability. We've got pilots that have been in the same base for 15 years. They're my neighbors, so I know that.
I understand that.
You can't just talk in those absolute terms and not leave it hanging there.
But
I'm going to allow Dan to respond here, and then we'll have to save this. And I think our panelists are going to stick around for a little
if I may
post-mortem powwow
okay.
for about 10 minutes here. But Dan,
Yeah,
you want to offer a response?
Based on, you know, my exposure to pilot groups, you know, Rick's old United group, and several others, that I was sort of staggered, and it may underlie the things that Rick is talking about, but there's one group of pilots in the industry, in the passenger carrier industry, who has wages that have exceeded the cost of living consistently since 9/11, and that group is the Southwest Airlines pilots. They've had about 45 to 50% across the board scale increases that first started out by Herb Kelleher, followed on by subsequent managements. But at the end of the day, if you're to look at just pilot pay alone and say which group skipped off the water of 9/11 and never went under, it was Southwest Airlines. Okay, so one of the hired guns that the Southwest pilots brought in to address a convention of Southwest pilots was a guy named Don Skiatos, who was a former employee of ALPA, a PR guy, and he has kind of a razzmatazz show to get everybody engaged, and you know, he's up on stage, and he started off his talk by saying to this group of leadership from Southwest Airlines Pilot Association, now you guys are all pilots, it's a great job. He goes, how many of you guys would do it over again, and how many of you guys would recommend that to other people that this is the greatest profession in the world? And there's 35 leaders at Southwest Airlines, most of whom make over $230,000 to $300,000 a year. Nobody raised their hand. He thought they misunderstood the question. He said, did you hear what I said? I didn't say not entertain, I said to entertain a career in the airline industry. And again, crickets. And so it threw Don off so much that he'd never expected that, and I never expected it. So even at airlines that have had very limited exposure to the negative side of being in the business, pilots at that airline still would not recommend that career path. And that was staggering to me. And if Southwest pilots wouldn't entertain a career path in the airline business, what does it say about all the other carriers who've had ramifications from exposure to 9/11 and the SARS and wars and all the other things that have affected us? That to me kind of says it all. If you can't get pilots to entertain cadet pilots to say, this is a great job, I work at Southwest Airlines, come on and join me, we have a really big problem on the pilot supply side.
So for all of the panelists, what should we be doing about that? And as we wrap up here, we talked about the very pressing need for a short-term fix to this, but what should we be doing as the industry collectively to look at the challenge of attracting new future aviators to our business? And also, if you want to talk about how should we be rethinking the way we train our commercial airline pilots in the United States? I'll start with you, Dan, and just go along down the line.
Well, I think, Faye, the obvious question, it's a longer-term question than how many pilots do we have tomorrow at Brian's Human Resources Department that are qualified and he would accept as candidates to fly for Republic Airlines. I think it's really the linkage that we need to establish between airlines who depend on pilot schools to produce pilots that are qualified to fly their equipment is the fundamental key. That is the new dynamic that we have to establish here. That is partnerships with Brian's Airline and universities that are more than just handshakes, that are more than just, I'll give you a little pin that says Republic Airlines on it. It actually is a financial engagement.
Pretty pen.
There's actually a commitment that has to be established that foreign carriers have established for years and that we used to have. And I think the other part of it is to figure out a creative way that if there is such an engagement between airlines and flight schools, that we have to figure out another way to get this volume of pilots through the pipeline, which focuses on how big a pipeline is there out there, how many people can we put through that pipeline, either on a general aviation approach or some other approach, sending pilots abroad to fly at places where they're legal to fly and then come back. And I think those three elements, linking the flight schools with airlines and linking the airlines to a pipeline to get people qualified, is sort of the new structure. The quick path is to have some type of apprenticeship program that Rick was talking about, that he was watching dials in the back of the airplane. We don't have that anymore, but we do have a program where 250-hour pilots used to be safe flying regional airplanes into Newark and Chicago that now take 2 or 3 years to become safe again, and it's based on nothing. It's based on a knee-jerk reaction. It's not based on any kind of empirical evidence, and those are the places I think we have to go. I mean, it's a structural thing. It's not, no one has it in their corner pocket here to say this is the fix. It's a long-term structural approach, and it's got to be a sustained system. It's just not a one-trick pony, because after 2022, we've still got all kinds of pilots reaching age 65. So when I look at it, I'm looking at the next 8 years, and if you push that out another 10 or 12 years, that's when you get into the Boeing 500,000 pilot demand worldwide, mostly based on growth. And we're at a deficit in this country because we require a higher standard. We can't put a corral around our country and say a pilot that just left Embry-Riddle that's a U.S. citizen can't go fly for Emirates or can't go fly for Cathay, because that's a better job than flying for Wasilla or flying around with a banner or flying in circles over Lake Michigan as a CFI with foreign students in your cockpit. That's the situation we're in today.
Andrew?
Oh, I've got the solution right here. No, I would tend to agree that it's really about creating those pathways, new pathways to becoming an airline pilot. I mean, you could look at this sort of as a problem, that you've got this big gap now between 250, 300, 400 hours. Not that they were hiring at that rate, those low hours to begin with, but and 1,000 hours or 1,250 or 1,500 hours. You could look at that as a problem. You could look at it as an opportunity as well. I mean, there's sort of a market there now for pathways for getting those hours, for getting that kind of training, for developing some new kind of pilot training program that could be, that sort of bridge that gap. And I think it does involve the schools. It does involve the regional airlines and their major partners in particular. And it really is going to come down to the extent to which where the burden is going to sort of fall. Is it going to fall completely on the students? Is there going to be some help from industry? Is the government going to extend further student loans, things like this? Are they going to make it easier those pipelines, those sort of ways to get to that level are what's needed.
Well, again, I'd like to take sort of the here and now perspective versus the longer term perspective, which I think Dan and Andrew have addressed. You know, the here and now is broad coalition. It's got to include the university and structured training stakeholders. It has to include the small town community stakeholders, the local airport stakeholders, all of the manufacturing and related jobs who are dependent upon aviation and transportation stakeholders. Frankly, I think it needs to include organized labor stakeholders, because this is also, these jobs are members, future members, current members, and a diminishing population of air transport pilots means a diminishing population of aircraft mechanics, aircraft dispatchers, all of whom are members of organized labor. So I think everybody in this room has a dog in this fight. So in the here and now, I think the advocacy needs to be, one, urging Congress to pick up the phone and simply call FAA, not change the law, not amend the law, not rethink the law, not rediscuss the law, but just call the FAA and strongly urge them to implement the ARC recommendation, again, which was based on broad stakeholder input. That ARC, if it were implemented, would create some runway for us in the here and now. Point two, again, get Congress to urge FAA to reinterpret the simple word of academic. What is academic? Today, Congress gave FAA broad authority, academic, small a, not capital A, to look at all forms of structured training for potential credit, super credit toward the 1,500-hour restricted ATP. Unfortunately, FAA decided to interpret that using a Webster's dictionary as opposed to Congress's intent. That needs to be fixed. And then finally, the third piece of the puzzle is, in fact, some economic assistance to help young men and women with educational financial obligations and the post-training obligation, which frankly the regional airlines are going to have to step up and help fill that gap. That's in the here and now. That will create some runway if we're all speaking with one voice and using our advocacy in Congress effectively. The longer term issues absolutely need to also be discussed today, but I'm somewhat concerned about looking at a foreign carrier model and saying, hey, let's go do what they do. If we really talk to people in China about how they train pilots here, it's different. It sounds good if they say, hey, we'll put you through college and we'll pay for you to become an airline pilot, but the pilot doesn't actually own his certificate. The airline owns that certificate. And if that pilot severs his relationship with that airline, he's no longer a commercial airline pilot in China, okay? So I don't think those models necessarily are portable here. The same thing about this, let's go fly to Emirates. I've known people who have flown at Emirates. You sign a contract, you work for them at their will. You don't take that plane's broken, you're fatigued, you're done. Goodbye. You're not, again, there's no collective bargaining at Emirates, at Qatar, at Etihad. So again, they're different models completely, and I don't know that they're necessarily portable here, but again, the here and now needs to be an advocacy approach to getting Congress to call FAA to do what they were told to do 2 years ago, which they refused to do it correctly. And the second piece, again, is partnering with the educational stakeholders and the regional airline business to create a cleaner, less costly pathway into the commercial aviation business.
Well, thank you. Thanks to you and the audience. This was a very good, engaging conversation, and it's a very important one. Again, we'll be focusing on this. But thanks to all of our panelists, Dan, Andrew, and Brian. And that's a wrap.
Let's have a real big round of applause. Thanks our